This is the Rutherford B Hayes Coachworks from Master Creations. And after building Master Creations Muldoon's Distillery, I swear I would never build another kit from them, but here we are. This kit came out in 1989, so that was actually about 2 years before the Muldoon's Distillery kit, so this is an earlier kit. I guess I would say Muldoon's Distillery is a more difficult build, but this one is not easy. The instructions are not very clear. There are some missing diagrams. One of the things that makes the instructions difficult is there are not any photos of the build in progress. All you have is some black and white photos of the build after it's been completed. And in this particular case, those completed build photos do not really help very much. This kit includes a cast resin base, a number of cast resin pieces, some cast metal walls, some cast metal accessories, some roof shingles, and some scale lumber and the wall pieces. There are a couple sheets of photo etched metal, and that includes the parts for an old car that looks like a pretty daunting build. The kit also includes a dry transfer decal sign to go on one of the walls, but I didn't use it. Because of the elevation change in the building from the front to the back, you basically have to build this as a diorama. It'd be very difficult to build this as a standalone building. Also, the walls are actually kind of integrated in with the building. So if you were to try to build it as a standalone building, you'd have to leave off some of the sheds. This kit is designed to be built as a burnt out and abandoned building. He says that you can build it as a complete building, but there's one wall section that it comes damaged, and I don't know how you would replace that wall section to make it look like a complete building. This kit still shows up on eBay with prices in the $200 to $400 range. You can probably get it for around $250 if you're willing to wait around long enough. Master Creations is the company founded by David Spence, and it's very difficult to find out any information about the company. I haven't been able to find out how many of each kit were made, or the entire product line of kits. The instructions make reference to him using CAD software to design the kits. He must have been a pretty technical guy because CAD software in 1989 was pretty difficult to use and required pretty powerful computers. Also, the poor quality of the instructions makes me think he was one of those people who is really good at building things, but not very good at explaining things. I think of all the people who have started these craftsman kit companies, he's the one that I would most like to meet. I'd like to find out what went into making each one of these kits and why they ended up being so difficult to put together. And he must have been a pretty good builder to be able to build the samples that he did for the cover art. Master Creations kits have such a reputation for being difficult to build. I'm just amazed that anybody ever bought a second kit after trying a first one. But then I did. Even so, I wonder how many of these kits actually got finished. Most of the castings in this kit are pretty high quality. The walls are really nice, and if you can get this kit really cheap, I would buy it just for the walls. This video is going to be a little bit different than the ones I've done in the past. It's going to be mostly voiceover, but there's going to be a little bit of me talking through the build. So I hope that's not too annoying. It's just the nature of this build kind of required that. Well, already everything is off to a pretty rough start. About the only diagrams in the kit are these foundation drawings, and they are not particularly detailed or legible. The first actual piece of assembly is apparently these two pieces get glued together somehow, but there's really nothing that indicates how they fit together. It could be kind of any side. And he says to refer to the photos and the foundation drawings to see how they fit together, so that's not much help. Next is these four walls, and I did figure out how these fit together, so I am going to do those. There's buildings 1 and 2, and these are buildings 1 and 2. It took me about 5 minutes to try and figure out which one is which, so that should be kind of straightforward to get those started. Well, I figured out that these two pieces go together like this. So this is the interior of the lower building, and I think this is a porch, and then this is another porch. And in some of the pictures, there's a little vehicle popping out here. So it goes together like this. I don't know why there's brick on this side in that case. And there's just a giant gap. So that's pretty weird. So we'll save that for later. As you would expect, assembly starts with bracing the walls and adding trim. So I'm doing that here. This is the upper part of the building. This is pretty standard stuff, pretty much the same in all of these Craftsman kits. I usually just cut the trim pieces too long and then trimmed them down after I've attached them. You want to be sure to label the walls and indicate which direction is up. With this building, it's pretty easy to put one of the walls on upside down. I'm in the process of putting these doors into this wall, and you're supposed to put trim on. And in order to do that, you're supposed to use this overlay, overlay A, and line it up on this elevation drawing, which has an overlay B, a D, and a C, but nowhere do I see a registration mark for overlay A. So I kind of feel like it just goes on somewhere like that. So it's almost useless. I think the easiest thing to do is just look at the drawing and put the trim in. And I would say that these doors are really nice. These are really nice resin castings. The front wall of the building has this decorative detail that is photo etched brass, so I'm assembling it now. Now I'm adding the decorative wood trim pieces. The instructions really aren't much help for this section. You really just have to go by the pictures. This wall is burned away, so he gives you this template to create the studs and the inside wall of the building, and then it'll go on something kind of like that. And another typo, he calls this template A, but there is no A anywhere. You just have to figure out that it's template A. There's only 2 templates, so it wasn't really all that difficult, but still kind of annoying. I think the easiest way to build these wall sections is to start with the 2 end boards, then glue in the cross beams, and then come back and fill in the middle boards. This kit has a lot of wall and floor sections that are built like this, so I got a lot of experience with it. The windows in this kit are cast resin and they are very fragile. I'm gluing them in using 5-minute epoxy, although this didn't really work very well because one of the windows did fall out. At least some of the windows are cast to look as if they are already broken. The look of the windows doesn't really matter too much if you're going to board them up anyway, as I did, but at the time I was putting them in, I wasn't sure I was going to board them up. So now it's time to attach the interior wall to the burnt out section. I'm using the intact wall to make sure that I get the length right. It turns out I wouldn't get the length right. The walls didn't fit. I would have to do some trimming anyway. This is the porch area, and for the underneath area, he said you're supposed to scenic it, and I just put in some Woodland Scenics turf, which I don't think is going to be very visible. And then he instructs you to start building the porch over top of this resin piece. But I wanted to build it separately because I think it'll be easier to paint, although it's a little more difficult to build. But I got it started. Once you get it started, it's not so bad. And then for some of the boards, I'm kind of scalloping the sides, make them look a little more worn. I really don't think he gave enough scale lumber for this kit. So if you're going to build this kit, you're going to want to buy some extra scale lumber. That's especially true for the way I built the kit. And also, for some of the sections, I had to rebuild them a second time because the first time I didn't really like the way they fit. So that definitely requires some extra lumber. Well, the next thing to build is the building one loading dock, and it says to lay a piece of wax paper over the artist's overview drawing of the dock. However, I cannot find such a drawing. It's possible that the person who had this kit originally took the drawing, but I think it's more likely there just never was a drawing. So I'm gonna have to come back to the loading dock, and once I have a better idea of the size of the buildings, I will just build one on my own. Now it's time to build the roofs. This starts by cutting out the roof sections from the card provided. You want to use a sharp knife blade for this. I went through several blades. There's a lot of cutting involved for these roofs. The roof sections have pre-marked holes that you're supposed to cut out, and then you'll build the rafters underneath these holes. The roof shingles come on this roll, and it has a sticky backing. So rather than lick the sticky backing, it's a lot easier to just use a wet sponge and run the sheets over the sponge and then attach them to the roof stock. In the past, I haven't really liked this type of shingle, but I think I finally got the hang of it, and now I actually kind of like it. This one roll turned out to be just enough shingle for the entire kit. There was a little bit left to spare. Look at the square holes for the skylights. I think I was pretty accurate in cutting out the holes for the skylights using the size marked on the template. But we'll find out later that the holes were too small. The skylights didn't fit and I had to enlarge them. The wet shingles caused the cardboard to curl, so I had to put bracing on the underside. Now I need to trim the excess shingles from the sides and cut out the holes in the roof. Here I'm attaching the roof boards and rafters underneath the holes in the roof. Now it's time to start painting. I wanted to give the building an old, worn gray color, kind of like these buildings here. I started by priming the walls with a gray enamel primer, and the base color is going to be Americana Slate Gray. The next color is Americana Gray Storm, and I'm applying that with a sponge. I prefer to use natural sponges that you can get at any art supply store, usually in the artist paint section. Now everything gets a coat of Vallejo dark gray wash. You could just use a wash of black acrylic paint, but I found that the Vallejo washes are much less likely to leave water spots. You could also use a black enamel wash. The next step is a fairly heavy dry brush of Vallejo Silver Gray. Now I'm applying white with a sponge. This is intended to be the original main building color. I'm applying very little and I'm really just focusing on the trim areas. I really want it to look like most of the paint has worn away. Now we're back to the roofs. This roof is a little bit tricky because you have to form it into a pyramid. I have to cut away some parts of my bracing so that the roof pieces fit. I hold the seam together with a strip of construction paper. The masking tape that you see is just holding the roof together. I was a little bit too aggressive with the knife when I was scoring the corners. Now it's finally time to start assembling the walls, so I'm using the base as a template to keep the walls square. The instructions call for gluing the walls to the base around this time, but I didn't do that because I thought it would make painting and assembly more difficult later on. Now I'm adding the roof sheet to the upper building. So one of the challenges here is that once you've done this, the inside of the upper building is completely sealed, so you have to make sure that your window panes have been added. I didn't really put very many window panes in, and those that I did I broke. I'm going to be spraying with dull coat later, and I decided I didn't really care if the window panes got fogged over because it would probably look realistic. This building has several sheds. This is the one that I think is called the large shed. There was supposed to be a diagram for it, but I couldn't find it, so I just decided to scratch build it using my own design. So, for example, the instructions say the large shed will be constructed directly over the artist drawings in your kit. Is he referring to the drawings that are not to scale? Or was there some other drawing that was missing from my kit? By this point, I've really started to ignore the instructions and just kind of treat this as a scratch build using the photos and drawings as a guide. For this shed, I really wanted to give the walls a really rotted and dilapidated appearance, kind of like this barn. I built the shed before I found this barn, but this is what I had in my mind. I do this by scalping away the sides of the boards, leaving some of the boards off and breaking others. The dormers are a mix of resin and wood, so I'm gluing them together using 5-minute epoxy. Now it's time to attach the roof to the building. I painted the roof using an airbrush with Vallejo NATO Brown. I use 1, 2, 3 blocks creatively to hold the roof in place as the glue dries. I attached the dormers using super glue gel. Trying to get a really good fit and appearance on the dormers is one of the challenges on this kit, and dormers are usually pretty difficult on any kit. I'm starting to take a look at how everything fits together. So this is the one of the building bases, and I propped it up on stilts, and it goes about like this. So this building goes here. This building goes here. And this notch lines up with this notch. And one of the problems is, it sure looks like these walls are too long. So I think that this is supposed to come up against the wall. And I don't think that's my mistake. I think that's the building itself. Because there's this little bit of overhang that I think is supposed to go over there. And even if it doesn't, the roof is too short. So I could lengthen the roof or shorten the walls. And then this is the large shed, it goes here. And then there's a porch that goes here. This is a little elevator. It goes about like that. So you can see, just like looking at this side, there's quite a bit of an elevation change on the profile. Back to painting. The shed is just a basic gray color, and then we get this pretty heavy wash of Vallejo dark gray. And then once again, a dry brush of Vallejo silver gray. I'm using strips of brown construction paper to add the crown to the roof and to the dormers, and then also to fill in the gaps between the dormers and the roof. The dormers have these little decorative pieces that are on the sheet of photo etched brass, so I'm attaching those using super glue gel. The dormers also get these little wood trim details. The skylight frames are photo etched brass. I found that my holes for the skylights were too small, so I'm trying to enlarge them with a razor blade. Once I got the skylights to fit, I glued them in using 5-minute epoxy. I found that it was easier to glue in a wooden support on the sides to help hold them in place because there's not a lot of contact area otherwise. As I mentioned, the buildings didn't quite fit together because the walls were too long. For the damaged wall, I just nipped away the excess. For the solid wall, I cut it apart using a Dremel tool and then did some sanding. I went back and did touch-up painting on the roof, and now I'm giving the walls a wash of folk art barnwood. I use an airbrush to blacken the burned out areas. Now I'm applying brown weathering powders to the building, and I'll seal these with acrylic sealer. The building already has the window panes in. I don't really care that the acrylic sealer is going to fog up the window panes. I think it'll just make them look like they're dirty old windows. Now it's time to start working on the base. The base starts as a piece of plywood. It's about 12 inches by 14 inches, and that ended up being too small. It probably needs to be about 2 inches longer in each direction. So the first thing I'm going to do is glue the resin pieces down to the plywood. I'm using 5-minute epoxy for that. Note that the resin base is slightly off-center of the plywood. This is because the walls on the right side are a little bit longer than the walls on the left. I built up around the base using sheet foam insulation, and now I'm applying Sculptamold. It took about 5 or 6 sessions of Sculptamold to get the ground level up to where I wanted it. When applying Sculptamold, it's useful to keep a spray bottle on hand so that you can spray down the Sculptamold. It makes it easier to smooth out. Now I'm adding in the wall sections and using Sculptamold to build up around the walls. It's very difficult to do this without getting some bits of Sculptamold on the walls. I tried to paint over just the little bits, but I basically ended up repainting all of the walls. It wasn't that difficult while it was still on the base, so it wasn't really a big deal. Keep in mind that if I followed the order of the instructions, the entire building would be built by now. I think it would be much more difficult to apply this Sculptamold with the entire building intact. This is why I waited to build it later, after the base was complete. After the Sculptamold dried, I paint the entire base using a brown latex house paint. Just make sure you get a matte finish. In an effort to keep the paint off the walls, I used cheap acrylic artist paints and a smaller brush to paint the base around the walls. It's very difficult to smooth out the Sculptamold right up against the walls. You usually get like a lot of crevices and voids. So I'm filling those in using a Vallejo ground texture. After repainting the walls, I painted much of the ground green in preparation for the grass cover. Now I'm applying matte Mod Podge to glue down the grass. The ground cover is just different shades of Woodland Scenics turf. I like to use these Parmesan shakers. It gives me a little bit better control spreading over the ground cover. I wanted the area to look pretty overgrown, so I'm applying a lot of static grass around the base. Now I'm applying some bits of Woodland Scenics coarse turf, and later on I'll apply some clump foliage. After all the ground cover is applied, I'll spray the entire area with Woodland Scenic cement. After the scenic cement dried, I did some light overspray of greens and browns with an airbrush. In case you're actually thinking of building this and using my video as something of a reference, one thing that I did wrong is this corner is way too low. This section of wall should come up so that the top of this wall is flush with the top of this wall, so it's all up higher. And then there's this other section of wall which goes up on top of it. So it kind of looks like this section of wall will go up really this high. And he put railroad track on this section here so that this loading dock actually comes out to the railroad track. So basically my corner is just way too low in this section. Also, I really didn't make this base long enough. If you were to have a track coming over here, he put the rest of these pillars on the other side of the track. And that's kind of visible in this photo where actually the build is somewhat incomplete, where he has the track section here. One of the consequences of my mistake here was that there wasn't a fence piece that was long enough to go from here to here. So I added in this middle pillar, and I'll put the two pieces of fence in there. These sections of fence are easier because you can put the fence in first and then add the post at the correct position, instead of having to cut the fence to fit the post differences. There are two types of posts. These posts have a base and they go flat on the ground. The other posts don't have a base and they go mounted on the walls. And these fence pieces, they're just barely glued in there. It's pretty fragile. There's just not a lot of contact area for the glue. I'm trying to fit the buildings together and I don't see how this fits without there being gaps. So the problem really is that this building needs to be exactly as wide as the outside of the brick. And I don't see how the brick goes together any other way. So I think I put the brick together correctly. But now if you push it all the way over so it touches this building and is flush on this wall, you have a pretty hefty gap over here on this side, so much that you can even see down into the foundation. This has to be flush because there's a chimney that's going to go in here. Something like that. And there's just gaps everywhere. It's kind of frustrating. So he built all this using CAD. I would have thought he would have gotten a little better precision on his cuts. Well, this is how much of a gap is left if I put the building in about the best position. And it's basically the thickness of the wall. So I think what I might do is just rebuild this deck so that the boards come all the way out up to the building. And that will solve that problem. It's kind of a shame because I really like this deck. This was basically, well, not basically scratch built. This was a scratch built deck. And then over here, this shed that goes in this spot is also scratch built. Well, here's another item that doesn't fit. This support is made using this diagram. And it's supposed to go here over this rock wall, but it comes out about 1/4 of an inch too far. So it's the correct width here. Like here's the building width. But this rock wall section seems to be too short for the building support. So there's supposed to be like the support holds up a shed with just like a little roof area over here, which really is pretty optional. You could just leave that off. I did decide to rebuild this deck, so now that you can see that it fits flush over the wall. Another thing is, if you're going to build this kit, you want to make sure that the surface of this piece here comes up flush with the top of the wall. I didn't do that, obviously. So the little shed that goes here has a door, so I raised the door up off the bottom, but it still sits lower than the deck floor. While we're nearing the end, I got the buildings attached, and now I'm adding the chimney, and I'm using 5-minute epoxy for that. Well, to fix this support, I just cut it in half, shortened it, and glued it back together again. And now I'm adding the roof for this shed area. So I scratch built the roof, and then I used corrugated sheet metal from previous builds. The kit includes corrugated sheet metal, but I had a lot of pieces from previous builds, so I just used those. Now I'm going around and I'm touching up the groundwork and the brickwork with Vallejo slimy grime. One of the final pieces of assembly is the roof for the porch. This I scratch built, and the tar paper came from buildersinscale.com. The kit includes tar paper, and it also includes cardstock for the roof, but I decided just to build my own, and I had the tar paper from a previous project, so I decided to use it. I also decided to add a lot of clump foliage around on the ground cover. You can see the woodland scenic cement is still wet.
Got to put you down for a while. Well, you know I can't quit you, babe, but I got to put you down for a while. Yes, you must know my happy home, baby. Made me mistreat my only child. Yes, you know I love you, baby. My love for you I could never hide. Well, I'm so tired I could cry. I could just lay down and die. Oh, I'm so tired I could cry. I could just lay down and die. Yes, you know you're the honest one, darling. Well, you just my heart desire. When you hear me moaning and groaning, babe, you know it hurt me.